Good morning and welcome to the Point. As the legislature and governor continue to work on a budget, we continue to talk about possible changes to the way elections are held. Senator Sean McCann's a Democrat from Kalamazoo, and recently he introduced what he would like to see as changes in the campaign finance law. Senator, let's talk about campaign finance reform. It's a phrase that if I had $1 for every time a politician had talked about it, I could probably make a campaign contribution. But here's the point. You and many of your colleagues believe that there is too much money in the political system. And you point to a particular event back in 2013 in the state that effectively doubled how much money can go in. So let's just talk about that process, starting with the 2013 proposal that said the contribution limits were roughly $1,000, could go to $2,000, and there was another provision in there you didn't like. So talk to me about your proposal.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, this maybe isn't the, might not be the hugest start out of the gate, but I think it's an important one to come back and say, right off the top, we can see that no one asked for a doubling of campaign contributions in Michigan, and no one asked for that to be adjusted on an inflationary basis going forward so that no one had to vote on it ever again. So, I mean, this is a mystery to me. That I felt that the arguments in favor of it were weak, and I think it's just an opportunity to give people who have the higher donor capacity to get greater influence in the process. And to your other point, yes, we do need to talk about campaign finance reform in this respect, but also in many other respects in terms of transparency and dark money and PACs and just the outsized influence that money has come to have on our elections. We have much, much longer elections. I can't find somebody who wouldn't say, really, are we already talking about, next fall at this point in time? So, this is, I think, the beginning of a process for me. Yes, it's a reset, but it's also what else can we do at a state level as citizens to take our democracy back, similar to the way that redistricting reform passed on the ballot, and so did the ability for people to vote in a more easy fashion with those proposals 2 and 3 of 2018.
I want to come back and talk about both of those proposals because we've not yet seen the full impact of either of those, even though we've had an election with some of the new rules, but we'll come back for that in just a minute. I want to talk about your proposal and money. It takes a lot of money to run a campaign. Your supposition, if I get it right, is that it costs increasingly more money because people can put increasingly more money into campaigns. Is that more or less your take?
I think that's certainly an accurate take on it, and it's also that you have less things that are necessarily competitive in the legislative process, and this super concentrates money into just a few places. But yeah, absolutely, that's a spot-on take.
And when you talk about competitive districts, you're in one, and so you know firsthand, having both won and lost in this district, how competitive and how expensive it can be. Now, I don't remember the numbers, but there were only a handful of people that were able to give the maximum contributions. But those same handful of people who can give a maximum contribution to you or your opponent might be able to do so in any number of districts around the state. It was part of the point you were making, that those people have an undue influence.
Yeah, if you can, if you have the capacity to put $193,000 into the political system, you have a lot of influence across the state of Michigan. You're not just the citizen in your town voting for your state representative and your state senator and your governor. You're influencing races across the state of Michigan, possibly across state lines and other places. It's just an outsized influence, and that's what comes from being able to give those sums of money, legally and appropriately.
Yeah, and that dollar figure would be if you maxed everything you could spend during an election cycle statewide, and we're just talking about state races, right? We're talking about statewide races, state house and senate races, and those type of things.
Not federal, right?
Right, because the federal would be under a different jurisdiction. But let's talk a little bit about that automatic increase. It's tied to inflation, but as you point out, it can go up every year or every cycle.
So it adjusts every 4 years, but it takes the consumer price index of every year and adds it up to the 4-year amount to increase. And I I'm pretty sure that's how it works. But I mean, my point is that we need to not have that be a part of the process, and that that was a mechanism so that legislators don't have to come back again and be accountable to the people that, yes, they continued to vote for more and more increases of money into politics. So you take out the inflationary increase, you really think that limits should be increased, then you've got to argue that case and you've got to put your name on it.
When you rolled this package out, or rolled out this idea, it was brand new, just being introduced, and so now you have to go out and do your part to explain to your colleagues how this may work. Have you had preliminary conversations, or have you had casual conversations with some of your colleagues that will say, yeah, that's a great idea, but I got a really good race coming up in a couple of years? I mean, because obviously the nature of the beast is that elections don't wait.
I guess I'll have to see sort of where we go with the introduction from today, and see which colleagues are interested in really seeing this go forward and which maybe don't have an interest in it at all. I spent, I think, I've had a lot of casual conversations. Again, that refrain of who asked for more money in politics. But I'm also used to going after and talking about. I talked about gerrymandering a whole lot for a long time, and a lot of people pushed back and said, no one's going to understand that issue. It's too politically wonky. It'll never pass on a statewide ballot. But yet it happened. So this is what we do as office holders and as leaders: is we elevate and discuss the nature of an issue that's important to the core of our democracy. And I'm going to talk about it as long as I get the opportunity for it.
Let's talk about that very thing in Prop 2. And one of the interesting things about Prop 2 is you and I had talked about how to redraw districts in Michigan for years. And I always pointed out, kind of kidding you, that that would be a very good position for somebody to take if you wanted to make both the opposition party and your own party very uncomfortable. Because this was not necessarily a partisan issue, because when Democrats were in control of the House and Senate, they got to draw the lines just as Republicans have in the most recent. And just to reset, every 10 years there is a census. The year following that, the lines are redrawn for the U.S. House of Representatives, the State House, and the State Senate. And while the rules differ a bit from the federal offices to the state offices, it is all based on population. Mm-hmm. You and I had talked about how there were any number of these districts that were drawn in ridiculous shapes that didn't make any sense. And in the last major election cycle, a group of people came together and had a genius ad campaign, from my perspective, that showed the state of Michigan with nice, neat, square little boxes for all the districts, which is just silly because they can't be nice, neat, square little boxes. So that'll be the first surprise for some folks. But let's talk a little bit about that process. And we just recently did a show with Secretary of State. She talked about it. But from your perspective, what does that mean going forward for Michigan political office? I think you believe there'll be more competitive districts.
I do think there'll be more competitive districts from the next redistricting process, which obviously, as we know, is a few years out. But we're gonna. A few other states have done this. I think it's worked out. And yeah, I mean, you've got to have natural population shifts. You've got to represent natural communities of interest. And then how do you sort of configure and connect all the puzzle pieces, right? This is the whole process that a number of citizens now are going to get to participate in a transparent and open process. So I'm just excited to see the first round of it and what comes of it. No one knows. I think you would know as well as I do that it's anybody's guess in Lansing how a lot of things are going to look at the end of the day, and it's going to be a very interesting process to see what happens. So, but if you ultimately get to a place where there's more competitive districts, not every district is going to be a competitive district. We know that some places are going to be red and some are going to be blue, but there should be a lot more space in the middle so that it's not just 2 or 4, let's say, state senate races that are the competitive, that are 2 or 4 out of 38 races should not be the way it is. And then those 2 or 4 races should not get the lion's share of the donations and contributions coming into them. So that's what I hope we would see, is you spread out the competition amongst districts, and then you spread out the money as well.
One of the things that I find I'm fascinated by the process, and one of the things that I find somewhat interesting is that we draw these districts based on a number of people in a very mobile society. So the minute they're drawn, they're already not accurate, but there's not a great deal you can do about that. You have to have some representative sample. But how do you group areas together? I mean, yours is most of Kalamazoo County?
All of Kalamazoo County.
Okay, so
Perfect
you got the
square.
So that seems to be a natural constituency.
Yeah.
And yours is a competitive district, as we have pointed out. But there will be some areas where there'll be multiple counties, and then the question becomes, how do you marry those counties together, and what makes the most sense to have those put together? Congressional districts particularly, what makes sense there? Are those questions, and I say this with no disrespect, are those questions that people who are not familiar necessarily with the way the system works, so a citizens council, are going to be able to deal with accurately? Are they going to be able to take in the breadth of this? Because not because the legislature has gotten it right, I'm not suggesting that, but are they going to be able to come together with a group of people that can pull off a pretty heavy lift?
Well, I look forward to seeing this play out, and I think it will be, quite a large experiment. It won't be inventing the wheel the first time, because other states have done this, I think, successfully. But it will be out and open, transparent, done by average citizens who, if you trust a jury pool in a court matter, then this is the same dynamic. It's going to be picking a group of citizens kind of by a jury selection process, and they'll get to put it out in front. And I think it'll be just really fascinating to see, do you start at the tip of the Upper Peninsula and work your way down, or do you start at, Detroit and work your way out? I mean, that's just really, it's actually sort of above my pay grade at this point, but I'm going to learn a lot more about it.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, too, we don't know what the population shifts look like, and then there is another real possibility, and it seems to me that it is probably equally possible for Republicans and Democrats, is you're going to be sitting in a chamber, and you and your colleague, not in your case, but in some cases, may now be living in the same district after redistricting. I mean, all of those things are possible, so it is an interesting dynamic.
Well, and there tends to be a refrain that rural areas are red and cities are blue, but I mean, it's not based on geography or land. It's based on people. I think that tends to get lost in the conversation. And so, yeah, if you have more people living in a dense urban core, they're going to get a smaller district. And then what's it going to look like, in circles or squares moving outward? So that population shifting around. It's why we do the census every 10 years. It doesn't stay static, but could you make an argument for doing it every 5 or 6? I mean, that's probably bigger lifts.
McCann has only recently introduced his bill, and any action that would take place would be this fall at the very earliest. But there are other things going on when it comes to elections, and when we come back, we'll talk about some of the changes you voted on just last year. Next, To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. The 2018 election was very important in Michigan for a number of reasons, not the least of which you as voters decided to make big changes in redistricting and also how you can vote. We talked about that with Senator McCann. Let's talk a little bit about the other, I think sometimes more forgotten proposal that was passed with election reform in 2018. And that's really about access. That's about same-day registration. That's about no reason absentee voting, a number of other things. We've already seen an uptick in young voters who took advantage of some of that. How does that work along with Prop 2 and or maybe even in tandem with what you're talking about, appealing to maybe younger voters who are put off by big money in politics?
Yeah, I was just going to say exactly that. I mean, cynicism is, I got involved in the political process at a very young age. I've believed in it, I've engaged in it, but I've seen a lot of people along the way who have fallen off into cynicism. My vote doesn't count, or my involvement or my engagement doesn't matter at the end of the day. And that's really the beauty of this, is working sort of to try to change that. My whole life in public service has sort of been about that, which is no, we can make the system work for you. You can engage and make a difference, and you can have your vote count. And that's really rewarding comforting to me when we see things like Prop 3 pass, and look, it's easier for you to vote. You don't have to give a reason to walk into your clerk's office and vote. You can do it right up until the election, and hopefully that builds almost a generational confidence. I mean, we've sort of seen that generationally, going downward, right? Less and less participation, more and more cynicism, and I would really love to think that we've maybe hit the bottom and are tracking up now if we do these things, including, getting money out of politics.
Well, it's not just cynicism, it's a complete lack of confidence in government in many different levels, particularly as you talk about younger voters perhaps, which is not to suggest that others don't have that same thought process. You spoke when you introduced your bill about being a step, that this isn't the only thing you would like to see done. What do you think government can do on a day-to-day basis that could instill more confidence? I mean, transparency, we hear a lot. What could government do to be more transparent?
Well, I work very hard to serve citizens and be responsive to them and do all the things that I think are expected of a public office holder. And in fact, I was walking into Mayor Hopewell's State of the City address the other night and ran into somebody I know in the community, and he relayed a story to me about a woman whose 10-year-old child I had called because they had sent a letter to my office with an opinion about a particular issue, and how blown away that the child and the parent were that I took the time to make that phone call. And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of work, the kind of steps we need to take to make sure that there's confidence, but also people see, oh, my email got answered, or I saw you at my door. I was in fact knocking doors of constituents on Friday, and the reaction is great. It's oh my gosh, I can't believe my state senator is standing here at my door or calling me or emailing me back. So we're going to just keep doing those things as strongly as possible, and hopefully that replicates and spreads as we become more accountable, right? I mean, that's the thing. Yes, it's been a competitive district, but we all need to be accountable, and we could get into term limits, and we could get into how primaries, select candidates for safe seats, but I mean, there's a lot of waterfront there.
Well, there is, but I think it is that larger conversation because there's not, I think we have seen that it's pretty clear, there isn't a magic bullet that's going to say, okay, you do this and now I'm going to trust you as a government. It's what you just talked about, which is a daily pressure to be there. But there are all of those things. I mean, term limits is a very interesting question, one that hasn't come up because I think many people believe that whatever you want to do with term limits, it's the same thought process they had about redistricting. It's going to be too hard to do it because there are going to be too many people who are going to push back against it. And as a legislator, if you propose doing something new with term limits, it's going to look a little self-serving. Sure. But what has the impact of term limits been from your perspective? What does it do? What does it mean as somebody who's lived them?
Well, my refrain has not really changed, which is I feel that the redistricting issue ties to the term limits a great deal. If you can't, vote control your legislator, your representative through a fair election process, then you're going to set an artificial system in place instead. And that's where that cynicism and frustration and term limits, I think, all is born out of. Too much influence with money, too many districts that are drawn to keep an incumbent safe. I can't get my voice heard, so why should I bother with this process? And we've even got cases at the Supreme Court right now that we'll see how this goes. I mean, I didn't agree with the Supreme Court on Citizens United, and we'll see what happens with some of the cases that are in front of them right now. But that's really, I mean, to bring it back to term limits, I think it was an artificial mechanism that was an outgrowth of genuine voter frustration.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to get your take on something. We were talking about the surprise, and as we sat here, I should point out, Senate is not in session, and we don't anticipate any big movement on the budget. But you quickly pointed out we were surprised by auto no-fault insurance. I don't necessarily need to go down the auto no-fault. We've done several shows about that. But what I want to know is how should we interpret, outside looking in, seeing that group of people, Democratic governor, Republican Senate Majority Leader, Republican Speaker of the House, not to dismiss the Democratic leadership, but those three have to come to an agreement for sure if you're going to get something like that put up for a vote, much less put up for a vote and pass. What should we make of the relationship between the amongst the leadership in Lansing in the early going of this new administration? Because that's a lift 30 years in coming, and it surprised me.
Yeah, I'm still optimistic. I know there's going to be battles that are going to be places where people aren't going to agree, and they're just going to have to agree to disagree. But I think exactly that sort of spirit that came out of getting to a deal on auto insurance reform. Maybe we can, keep that goodwill going and tackle some of our biggest issues as the state of Michigan. I mean, imagine the confidence that would instill if we really did, invest in our roads, make sure our water's clean, fund our schools, and balance the budget with, a different dynamic than has been present for the last 8 years. And I mean, I'm hopeful. I think there's going to be high-level conversations, but I also think at the end of the day, like you say, there's got to be the ability to get a package through with enough votes to move it through the chambers.
I always like to ask this question of people who move from one chamber to the other, and since you have that perspective, what is it like, or how is it different, being one of 38 instead of one of 110? Because just, again, as an observer going from one chamber to the other, they have a very different feel.
They do, and I'm still getting used to that whole process. I actually found that when I was in a row of desks with 2 or 3 others next to me, I got to know folks a lot better, and we have different ways of moving and interacting, and the term length, I think, adds a different flavor to it when you're there and you're going to have relationships for people for a longer period of time potentially. Then maybe you look at things a little bit more different. So it's probably the outcome of a similar dynamic with the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Maybe one's more of a cooling chamber of sorts, and one sort of is more reactive and in touch with the everyday, ebbs and flows of life. So that's kind of where I'm at so far with it.
So some of the changes we talked about this morning will take place because they've been voted on and are now being implemented, and some are just proposals. But there is a sense in Lansing that a number of legislators, Republicans and Democrats, are looking to change the process to make it more transparent, something that voters say they want. We'll talk more about that and have a final note when we come back. To the point. Changing the way we cast our votes, changing the way we draw the lines, perhaps changing the way that money can be collected in elections. There's a lot of conversation going on in Lansing. As we pointed out, some of it's going to happen, some of it has just been proposed. But it's one more thing we'll be watching as we also watch the developing budget negotiations in the state capitol. The past couple of weeks, things have been relatively slow. The legislature has not been in session, but we know conversations are continuing. It's something we'll continue to follow this week and talk to you about next Sunday. To the point.